The legend of the Holy Grail begins not in one place, but in many, woven from threads of history, myth, and religious belief that stretch across centuries and civilizations. Though most popularly associated with Christian traditions and Arthurian legends, the origins of the Grail reach deep into the collective imagination of humanity, where sacred vessels and divine objects have always carried immense symbolic power. In its earliest form, the Grail does not appear in the Bible. The canonical scriptures make no mention of a cup that holds mystical powers or grants eternal life. Yet the idea of a sacred chalice is not entirely foreign to the Christian narrative. During the Last Supper, Jesus is described as sharing a cup of wine with his disciples, declaring it as his blood of the covenant. This moment, central to the institution of the Eucharist, would later become a foundational element in the myth of the Holy Grail. But it was not until centuries later that this cup would be imbued with supernatural qualities and elevated to the status of a relic of ultimate divine power. The Grail's evolution into legend began in earnest in the 12th century with the flowering of chivalric romance in medieval Europe. The first known literary reference to a Grail occurs in Chrétien de Troyes' unfinished poem Perceval, Le Conte du Graal, written around 1180. In this narrative, the object in question is not yet the Holy Grail, as it would come to be known, but a mysterious vessel, described simply as a grail, borne in procession before a young knight. It glows with an unearthly light and has the power to heal. Chrétien gives no explanation for its origins, nor does he identify it with the Christian chalice. It remains an enigma, powerful, sacred, and elusive. Chrétien's tale ignited the imagination of Europe. Over the next century, the story of the Grail expanded and transformed through the hands of various authors who sought to Christianize and moralize the narrative. Chief among them was Robert de Boron, a French poet who, writing around the turn of the 13th century, explicitly connected the Grail to the chalice of the Last Supper. In his account, Joseph d'Arimathie, the cup is used by Joseph of Arimathea to collect the blood of Christ as he is taken down from the cross. From that moment, the Grail becomes a sacred Christian relic, linked to the Passion and Resurrection, and imbued with a powerful divine essence. Robert de Boron's tale also introduces the notion of the Grail being taken to Britain, either by Joseph of Arimathea or his descendants. This fusion of Christian relic and British legend marks a crucial turning point. It roots the Grail not just in heavenly mystery, but in the geography of the British Isles, particularly Glastonbury, a place steeped in myth, where early Christian traditions, Druidic lore, and Arthurian romance intersect. By the time the Vulgate cycle, a series of French prose romances, emerged in the early 13th century, the Grail had become firmly entrenched within the world of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. No longer merely a wondrous object, it was now the ultimate spiritual prize. The quest for the Holy Grail became an allegory for Christian virtue, spiritual purity, and the inner journey of the soul. Only the most worthy knight, ultimately Sir Galahad, the pure-hearted son of Lancelot, could achieve the vision of the Grail and attain divine communion. But why did the Grail capture the imagination of so many? What was it about this cup or stone or dish, depending on the version, that compelled generations of poets, priests, and seekers to chase its elusive promise? Part of the answer lies in its ambiguity. The Grail is never fully defined. In some tales it is a chalice, in others a platter, a stone, or even a cauldron with Celtic roots. This fluidity allowed the Grail to serve as a mirror to the spiritual yearnings of each age. In a time of crusades and rising religious zeal, it became a symbol of Christian redemption. In the later Romantic periods, it was a metaphor for individual enlightenment and unattainable love. In modern times, it has evolved into a symbol of hidden truth, the secret knowledge that lies just beyond reach. Celtic mythology also provides a powerful substratum to the Grail legend. Long before Christianity took root in Europe, Celtic stories spoke of magical cauldrons that could heal wounds, restore the dead, and provide endless sustenance. The cauldron of Dagda, for instance, never ran empty and could feed entire armies. The cauldron of rebirth in Welsh mythology could revive fallen warriors. These tales undoubtedly influenced the early Grail romances, blending native mythologies with imported Christian theology. Thus, the Grail is a composite object, part relic, part myth, part allegory. Its enduring power comes from its ability to transcend boundaries between pagan and Christian, myth and history, external journey and internal transformation. By the end of the Middle Ages, the Grail had become a central fixture in the spiritual imagination of Western Europe. It was no longer just a literary device or a motif of chivalric adventure. It had taken on a theological dimension, viewed by some as a symbol of divine grace and the soul's path to God. Monastic traditions, particularly those associated with mysticism and contemplative prayer, adopted the image of the Grail to speak of spiritual fulfillment, the union with the divine that could only be attained through purity of heart and surrender of self. At the same time, however, the Grail was beginning to recede from religious orthodoxy and step into the shadows of esotericism and mystery. As the Renaissance dawned and the Reformation redefined Christianity, the Grail remained in stories, symbols, and secret traditions, waiting to be rediscovered, reinterpreted, and reimagined. The story of the Holy Grail, then, begins not with a single moment or place, but with an idea that speaks to the human desire for transcendence, for connection with the divine, and for a truth that lies hidden beneath the surface of the world. Whether as chalice, cauldron, or stone, the Grail beckons us toward the unknown, offering not certainty, but the promise of a quest. By the 13th century, the Holy Grail had become inextricably linked with the world of King Arthur and his legendary court at Camelot. The Arthurian legends, already popular throughout Europe, provided a rich and compelling backdrop for the evolving narrative of the Grail. Through the fusion of chivalric adventure and spiritual allegory, the Grail became more than a relic. It became a symbol of divine questing, an ideal that both challenged and condemned the knights who dared to seek it. The fusion of the Grail with Arthurian myth began to crystallize with the works of Robert de Boron, whose account positioned the Grail as a Christian relic brought to Britain by Joseph of Arimathea. This narrative thread was further developed in the Vulgate Cycle, a massive compilation of French prose romances written between 1215 and 1235. In these texts, the Grail quest is not merely an adventure, but the culmination of Arthurian destiny, representing a trial of virtue, faith, and divine favor. The Vulgate Cycle introduces readers to a reimagined Round Table, one that is no longer concerned solely with worldly battles or the defense of the realm. Instead, the knights are called to pursue a spiritual calling, the quest for the Holy Grail. This shift marks a dramatic evolution in the character of Arthurian literature. No longer is heroism defined by strength or glory in battle. Now it is measured by chastity, humility, and spiritual purity. Among all the knights of Camelot, 3 rise as central figures in the Grail narrative: Sir Lancelot, Sir Percival, and Sir Galahad. Each embodies a different aspect of the human soul in its struggle toward the divine. Sir Lancelot, the greatest knight in terms of martial prowess, is also the most tragic. Though his courage and loyalty are legendary, his adulterous love for Queen Guinevere renders him unworthy of the Grail. His failure to attain the sacred object is a poignant commentary on the moral complexities of human nature, the notion that even the mightiest of heroes can fall short if their hearts are divided. Sir Percival, who first appeared in Chrétien de Troyes' original tale, represents innocence and curiosity. In later versions, he is portrayed as a naive but spiritually open young man whose journey toward maturity parallels his journey toward understanding the Grail. In the Vulgate Cycle, however, he is ultimately overshadowed by a new character, his nephew, Sir Galahad. Sir Galahad is the purest of them all. Introduced as the illegitimate son of Lancelot and Elaine, Galahad is raised in monastic surroundings and embodies the ideal of Christian knighthood. He is untainted by sin, immune to temptation, and completely devoted to God. From the moment he arrives at Camelot and takes his place at the Siege Perilous, the empty seat at the Round Table reserved for the knight destined to see the Grail, his fate is sealed. Only he can complete the quest, and only he is granted the vision of the divine. The journey of the Grail Knights is not a conventional one. It is not marked by battles against dragons or evil sorcerers, but by trials of the spirit. The knights face temptations, illusions, and moments of profound self-doubt. They are forced to confront their own weaknesses and the truths they have long denied. In this way, the Grail quest becomes an allegory for the inner life, a path of contemplation, repentance, and eventual enlightenment. As the stories unfold, the Grail itself changes in meaning and form. At times it appears as a simple chalice, sometimes accompanied by other mysterious objects, such as the bleeding lance or the silver dish. In some accounts, it is guarded by a hidden brotherhood of monks or knights, Grail keepers, who protect its secrets from the unworthy. The location of the Grail is always ambiguous, often shifting from castle to forest, desert to island, underscoring its otherworldly nature. It exists on the border between the sacred and the mundane, always present yet always out of reach. The climax of the Vulgate cycle arrives when Galahad, having proven his worth through countless trials, finally beholds the Grail in a vision so holy that it cannot be fully described. He is taken to a distant realm, sometimes called the earthly paradise, sometimes interpreted as heaven itself, where he dies in ecstasy, having seen the face of God. The Grail, now fulfilled in its purpose, disappears from the world. This ending is both triumphant and tragic. The Grail has been achieved, but at great cost. Galahad's death signifies that the divine cannot fully coexist with the corrupt world of men. The Round Table, having reached its spiritual peak, begins to dissolve. Camelot falls into decline. Arthur's kingdom, once the symbol of ideal governance and unity, is shattered by betrayal and war. In this sense, the Grail quest marks the end of an era, the last great chapter in the saga of Arthurian chivalry. Yet the power of the Grail legend did not fade with the fall of Camelot. Instead, it grew. The stories were copied, translated, and adapted throughout Europe. In Germany, Wolfram von Eschenbach reimagined the tale in his epic Parzival, where the Grail becomes a magical stone of immense power, guarded by a secret brotherhood of Templars. In the hands of later writers, the Grail became a vessel of esoteric knowledge, a relic sought not just by knights but by alchemists, philosophers, and mystics. In England, the Grail legends merged with local myths and historical traditions. Glastonbury, with its ruined abbey and ancient thorn trees, came to be seen as the resting place of Joseph of Arimathea and the site where the Grail had once been hidden. The idea of Britain as a Grail land, a sacred island chosen by God, captured the national imagination, especially during times of crisis and spiritual longing. The Grail thus transcended its origins. It became a symbol of hope and healing, a reminder that something greater than human ambition lies just beyond the veil. The knights who sought it, whether they succeeded or failed, were transformed by the journey. And through their stories, readers too are invited to embark on their own inner quests, to seek the divine in a world full of shadows. By the end of the medieval period, the Grail had passed into legend, but it had also become something more. It had become a mirror for the human soul, pure, mysterious, and forever out of reach. As the legend of the Holy Grail matured, it moved beyond the pages of chivalric romance and entered the more abstract world of religious symbolism and theological reflection. The Grail became a multifaceted icon, no longer just a relic or a narrative device, but a profound metaphor embedded in the spiritual consciousness of medieval Europe. The theological interpretations of the Grail during the High Middle Ages were deeply influenced by the monastic movements and the mystical traditions that emerged across Christendom. The Grail, once understood as a literal cup, came to represent divine grace, the Eucharist, and the human soul's desire for union with God. In this symbolic framework, the journey of the knight toward the Grail was mirrored by the monk's ascetic path toward spiritual enlightenment. The Grail's most obvious theological parallel was the chalice used in the celebration of the Mass. For devout Christians, the Eucharist was not a mere symbol, but the actual presence of Christ, his body and blood, offered for the salvation of mankind. The idea that the Grail had held Christ's blood directly aligned it with this sacred ritual. In this light, the Grail was not just a relic, but a living vessel of divine presence, offering healing, illumination, and eternal life. This connection deepened with the rise of the cult of relics in medieval Europe. Relics, bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, drops of sacred blood, were believed to contain miraculous powers. Pilgrimages to relic sites became widespread, and entire towns were built around the idea of hosting divine artifacts. The Grail, though fictional in origin, was treated in literature with the same reverence given to these real-world relics. It became, in the imagination, the most precious relic of all, the vessel that had touched the blood of God. Mystical thinkers, particularly those influenced by Neoplatonism and Christian mysticism, saw in the Grail a metaphor for divine wisdom and spiritual receptivity. In these interpretations, the Grail was no longer an object to be found, but a state of being to be attained. The vessel represented the soul, empty, humble, and open to being filled by the divine. The Grail Knight, then, was a contemplative figure whose inner purification allowed him to receive the vision of God. Cistercian monks, known for their emphasis on purity and spiritual contemplation, were particularly drawn to such imagery. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential figures of the 12th century, often used the image of the chalice or cup in his sermons to describe the soul's relationship with God. Though Bernard never mentioned the Grail specifically, the language he employed resonated with later writers who sought to bridge the worlds of monastic theology and Grail romance. This theological symbolism also infused the very structure of Grail literature. In many versions of the story, the Grail castle is hidden, inaccessible to the impure. It is not found on maps, but is reached only through divine guidance, visions, or trials that test the seeker's virtue. The journey to the Grail is thus a metaphor for the path of sanctification, a process of suffering, revelation, and transformation. The spiritual nature of the Grail is further emphasized through the trials faced by the knights. Lancelot's failure is not due to lack of courage, but to sin. His love for Guinevere, though passionate and genuine, is adulterous, and it clouds his ability to see the divine. Galahad's success, by contrast, is not won through strength, but through moral perfection. He lives a life of chastity, prayer, and obedience. This shift in values reflects the influence of Christian ethics on the medieval imagination. Strength and valor are not enough. Only holiness can reach the Grail. The allegorical reading of the Grail also found a home in courtly love literature, where the quest for an idealized lady often mirrored the soul's longing for God. In this context, the Grail was interpreted as the ultimate beloved, perfect, distant, and transformative. Just as the courtly lover suffered for the sake of his lady, so too did the mystic suffer for the sake of divine union. Medieval theologians and poets alike delighted in the layers of meaning that the Grail afforded. To some, it was the cup of the Last Supper. To others, it was the Ark of the New Covenant, a vessel that held not the tablets of the law, but the living presence of Christ. Some compared it to the Virgin Mary, whose womb bore the divine word. Others saw it as the Church itself, holy, hidden, and filled with grace. This multiplicity of interpretations gave the Grail a unique status. Unlike other relics or symbols, it was never tied to a single dogma. It was always elusive, always open to reinterpretation. And because it existed primarily in literature and legend, it could absorb and reflect the spiritual currents of each generation. As scholasticism began to rise in medieval universities, the Grail also entered the realm of intellectual debate. Could such a relic truly exist? Was the blood of Christ ever preserved? Was the Grail a metaphor for transubstantiation, or a memory of ancient pagan rites? These questions were not easily answered, and they only added to the aura of mystery that surrounded the object. Interestingly, the Grail also began to appear in visual art. Illuminated manuscripts, cathedral carvings, and stained glass windows occasionally depicted scenes of the Grail procession, often placing it in a sacred and elevated context. Though these images were rare compared to more canonical biblical scenes, they demonstrate the cultural penetration of the legend. The Grail had moved from the margins of romance to the center of spiritual reflection. By the late Middle Ages, the Grail was a fully realized symbol in the religious consciousness of Europe. It represented the ultimate mystery of the faith, that God could become present in the world, that divine grace could be held, however briefly, by human hands. Whether seen as a literal cup, a mystical vessel, or the soul's deepest longing, the Grail invited all who heard its story to look beyond the visible, to seek the hidden truth that lay beneath appearances. The legend had begun as a chivalric tale, but it had become a meditation on the sacred. And while the Grail itself remained hidden, lost in time or ascended into heaven, the search for it continued, not on horseback but in the hearts of believers mystics and seekers of truth. As the legend of the Holy Grail continued to grow in scope and symbolism, a powerful and enigmatic brotherhood began to weave its own place into the story: the Knights Templar. Founded in the early 12th century to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, the Templars rapidly rose to prominence. Armed monks and mystics at once, they became one of the most formidable forces in medieval Christendom. Their wealth, autonomy, and secretive practices made them the perfect candidates for myth, and the Grail legend would not remain untouched by their shadow. The link between the Holy Grail and the Knights Templar did not appear immediately in the early Grail romances. Chrétien de Troyes and his successors made no explicit mention of the Templars, yet by the 13th and 14th centuries, connections began to emerge in esoteric texts and popular imagination. What drew the Templars into the Grail narrative was not historical fact, but symbolic association. The Templars were, after all, warrior monks, men who walked the line between the sacred and the profane, much like the Grail Knights in legend. The first notable link between the Grail and the Templars comes from the Wolfram von Eschenbach's version of the story, Parzival. In this reimagined German telling, the guardians of the Grail are not monks or saints, but a group called the Templisen, or Templars. Though not explicitly the historical Knights Templar, their name and nature suggest a clear echo. These Grail keepers live in a mysterious castle called Munsalvaeshka, and they protect the Grail, not as a cup, but as a radiant stone with miraculous properties. Von Eschenbach's Grail is not only Christian but also cosmological, and the brotherhood guarding it is portrayed as spiritually elite and ritually pure. This fusion of chivalric virtue, secrecy, and sacred guardianship resonated with contemporary perceptions of the real Knights Templar. The order had by then grown incredibly powerful, owning lands across Europe, commanding fleets, and acting as bankers to kings and popes. Yet their rituals remained largely unknown to outsiders. This aura of mystery was fertile ground for legends. Did the Templars discover the Grail in the Holy Land? Were they its secret custodians? Did they protect it from those unworthy of its power? One legend held that during the First Crusade, the Templars excavated beneath the ruins of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. There, it was said, they uncovered ancient relics, perhaps the Ark of the Covenant, perhaps the Grail itself. These stories, though lacking documentary evidence, spread across Europe. Chroniclers, poets, and even later mystics embellished the tale. According to some accounts, the Templars smuggled the Grail back to Europe and hid it in one of their fortresses, safe from the corruption of kings and clerics alike. Whether they possessed the Grail or not, the Templars embodied many of the same ideals associated with Grail seekers. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They fought for a sacred cause. They lived in communal discipline and answered only to the Pope. To many, they were the living image of divine knighthood, just as Galahad, the pure knight, was in the Grail legends. This parallel helped fuse the mythic and historical into a single narrative current. But the same secrecy that fueled their mystique would also spell their downfall. By the early 14th century, the Templars had become too powerful and too enigmatic for their own safety. King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the order and eager to consolidate power, accused the Templars of heresy, idolatry, and blasphemy. In 1307, he ordered their arrest. Under torture, many confessed to fantastic charges, worshipping idols, spitting on the cross, engaging in secret rituals. The Pope, under pressure, eventually disbanded the order. The dissolution of the Templars only intensified their myth. What secrets did they truly possess? Why were they silenced so brutally? Some believed the Church sought to suppress truths too dangerous to be known. Perhaps knowledge of the true Grail, perhaps ancient wisdom passed down from Jerusalem itself. The idea that the Templars were punished not for heresy, but for guarding a dangerous relic, became a cornerstone of Grail mythos. Later legends claimed that a group of Templars escaped persecution and fled to remote locations: Scotland, Aragon, even the New World. In these tales, the Grail was carried with them, hidden in mountains, caves, or chapels unknown to history. Sites like Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, steeped in Templar symbolism, became focal points of Grail speculation. There, carved into the stone, seekers found roses, stars, knights, and chalices, all interpreted as silent witnesses to the Grail's continued protection. The connection between the Templars and the Grail took on new life during the Renaissance and Enlightenment, when esoteric societies and occult thinkers began to reclaim the symbols of medieval mysticism. Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, and various secret societies embraced the image of the Grail as a symbol of inner illumination. In many of these systems, the Templars were seen not just as knights, but as keepers of perennial wisdom, guardians of a truth suppressed by organized religion and monarchy alike. In these new retellings, the Grail was no longer merely a Christian relic, but a universal archetype, the divine spark within, the light of the soul, the source of knowledge. The Templars became not martyrs to greed, but martyrs to truth. In preserving the Grail, they were preserving the sacred potential of humanity itself. Today, the link between the Holy Grail and the Knights Templar remains one of the most enduring elements of Grail mythology. Though no historical document confirms such a connection, the symbolic resonance is undeniable. Both the Grail and the Templars live on in the cultural imagination as emblems of purity, secrecy, and sacred quest. The Grail offered the promise of divine encounter. The Templars offered the courage to seek it. Together, they represent the eternal tension between earthly institutions and transcendent truth, between the visible church and the hidden mystery. And so, even after their destruction, the Templars remain alive, not in the annals of conventional history, but in the stories, legends, and longings of those who still search for the sacred. The Holy Grail, after centuries of stories, visions, and interpretations, has become more than just a legendary object. It is now a symbol that transcends religion, time, and geography. In many ways, the Grail is no longer about what it is or where it might be, but about what it represents, the deepest longing of the human soul, the thirst for transcendence, and the unending desire to bridge the material with the divine. The legend of the Grail has grown not because of historical certainty, but because of its capacity to evolve, to adapt to each generation's spiritual needs and existential questions. At the core of the Grail narrative lies the idea of a quest. This is not a simple pursuit for an artifact, but a profound journey of transformation. The knight who sets out to find the Grail is never the same person when or if they return. Whether it is Percival's path from ignorance to wisdom, Galahad's ascension through purity, or the wounded Fisher King awaiting redemption, the Grail stories always turn inward, asking, who are we and what are we truly seeking? In this way, the Grail is not about possession, but about revelation. It is never found by the greedy or the unworthy. It resists those who seek it for power or prestige. Only the humble, the faithful, the broken-hearted who still hope, these are the ones the Grail permits to draw near. And even then, the encounter is fleeting. The Grail vanishes, it withdraws, it refuses to be held. This elusive nature is perhaps its most enduring feature, echoing the spiritual truths across faiths, that the divine is not an object, but a presence, intimate, transforming, yet never fully grasped. Religious thinkers have long pondered the Grail's theological implications. In Christianity, the Grail has been linked with Christ's passion, with the Last Supper, and with the Eucharist. The idea that one might drink from the cup that held the Saviour's blood touches on the very mystery of redemption. Yet not all traditions have agreed on the Grail's nature. Is it a relic, an icon, or a metaphor? Is it a vessel of grace, or simply a story through which grace is communicated? For some theologians, the Grail is less a thing and more a signpost, pointing toward the greater reality of God's presence in the world. The Grail, then, is a parable. It teaches through the medium of myth. It inspires devotion not through facts, but through beauty and wonder. And in this, the Grail achieves what doctrine often cannot. It stirs the heart, it moves the soul, it opens the imagination. For others, especially mystics and esoteric thinkers, the Grail is the key to hidden knowledge. Throughout the centuries, various secret orders and philosophical schools have claimed to know the Grail's real meaning. Alchemists saw it as the philosopher's stone, capable of transforming the base into the sublime. Hermeticists spoke of it as the eternal feminine, the womb of divine creation. Some linked it to Atlantis, to the stars, to sacred geometry. In these visions, the Grail was not bound to Jerusalem or Christendom, but to a universal mystery, the eternal return of light into darkness and the hidden unity behind all dualities. In modern times, this pluralism has only deepened. Psychologists like Carl Jung interpreted the Grail as an archetype, an image embedded in the human psyche, representing wholeness and integration. In this reading, the quest for the Grail is the process of individuation, the journey through the unconscious to reconcile the fragmented self. The wounded king becomes the ego, the barren land the disconnected life, and the Grail the spark of healing hidden within. Writers, filmmakers, and artists have continued to explore these ideas, expanding the legend into countless forms. From novels and operas to video games and blockbusters, the Grail endures as both a literal and symbolic presence. It is sought in ancient castles, lost temples, bloodlines, or digital realities. Yet in each case, the narrative echoes the same truth. The journey changes the seeker. The Grail may not be real in the empirical sense, but its power is undeniable. It invites the question, what is my Grail? This universal aspect may explain the Grail's unusual longevity. While other medieval relics faded from memory or remained trapped in church display cases, the Grail grew. It became a mirror of the times. In ages of faith, it was divine. In times of war, it was a prize. In periods of doubt, it was a symbol of hope. And in the secular age, it has become a personal myth, a unique quest defined by each individual's longings and values. Some still claim to search for the Grail in literal terms. Over the years, dozens of chalices have been proposed as the true vessel of Christ. The Valencia chalice in Spain, the Antioch chalice, and others have sparked debate among historians and archaeologists. Some believe the Grail was never a cup at all, but a coded symbol of sacred lineage or ancient wisdom. Others maintain that it was always meant to be metaphorical, like a parable of Jesus, never to be taken at face value. But perhaps these questions miss the point. Perhaps the Grail endures not because of what it is, but because of what it calls forth in us. It is a summons to seek, to yearn, to believe. It reminds us that some truths cannot be proven, only lived, that the greatest treasures are not stored in vaults or guarded by dragons, but hidden in the heart, waiting to be awakened. In the end, the Grail is a paradox. It is sacred, yet secular, Christian, yet universal, ancient, yet always new. It belongs to no one tradition, and yet it speaks to all. It is both a memory and a promise, a relic of a golden age and the blueprint of a better future. The Grail is not the end of the story, but the invitation to write one's own. The eternal quest does not end with finding the Grail. In truth, it begins there. For those who glimpse it, even briefly, the world is never quite the same. They carry its light with them, into their struggles, their relationships, their work, their silence. And so the Grail continues, not as an object on a shelf or a myth in a book, but as a living call, to seek the sacred, to heal the broken, to serve the good. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of the Grail, not that it was found, but that it was sought. That across centuries of war, doubt, and wonder, people still looked beyond themselves and dared to believe in something more.